17th of December 2021.
North Korea claims to have tested a hypersonic missile.
Kim Jong Un.
Kim Jong Un.
I have a very good relationship with him.
From news.com.au.
I'm Andrew Bucklow, and I've got news for you. It's 10 years to the day since Kim Jong Un became supreme leader of North Korea, a country that often makes headlines with stories of brutal executions, threats of nuclear war, and of course, diplomacy with Donald Trump.
And then we fell in love. Okay? He wrote me beautiful letters.
But despite the extensive coverage, not much is known about what life is really like inside the Hermit Kingdom. Today, we'll meet one of the few Westerners who's lived in North Korea, and she'll reveal the extreme lengths the government goes to keep the nation shrouded in secrecy.
I think we always have to be aware that there are surveillance devices. Absolutely. And that's something that I do try to tell anyone who goes to North Korea to be aware, that there are possibly surveillance devices, listening audio devices in their hotel room.
We'll also take a look at Kim Jong Un's reign and find out just how serious he is about starting World War III. Jean Lee was the first American reporter granted extensive access on the ground in North Korea. She later opened Associated Press's Pyongyang bureau, which was the only Western news outlet based in the North Korean capital. Jean, firstly, how hard was it to be a journalist in North Korea?
It was tough, I have to say. I, as a journalist, covered so many stories in so many parts of the world, and North Korea was definitely the most challenging assignment on so many levels. Not just the access. It's difficult even to get a visa into the country. Right now, of course, they've closed the border, so it's impossible to get into the country. But even back then, it was so hard to get a visa as a journalist. Then when you get there, you have all the challenges of living and working in North Korea, not only just dealing with brutal conditions, but also just the lack of access. It's like, it can be like banging your head against a wall. So it was tough, but so rewarding in so many other ways.
You mentioned the lack of access. I imagine that they're quite distrusting of Western journalists. Did you have a minder wherever you went?
They think of journalism very differently. For them, journalists are propagandists. And so it's hard for them to understand how we do journalism. And so they see us as possible spies for our governments. And so, yeah, they want to have a minder with a journalist at all times. For me, running an operation on the ground, I didn't think of them so much as minders. They were my staff, but they certainly had a responsibility to make sure that we weren't breaking their laws. And let me tell you, their laws are the penal code is massive. So it's very easy to break the laws, especially as a foreigner. And we've had some very difficult cases of foreigners who've gone to North Korea and haven't been aware of these laws or haven't been aware of what the consequences were. And one of the cases is Otto Warmbier, who's an American college student who went to North Korea, this is 5-6 years ago, pulled a poster down from a part of his hotel that was meant for staff, and as you may know, was charged and prosecuted and was sentenced to hard labor. He spent more than a year in North Korean custody and was taken out of North Korea in 2017 in a coma, in a vegetative state, and then died not too long after coming back to the United States. That was something that we would consider maybe a prank. You know, it's something, obviously, you shouldn't be stealing things from hotels, but I don't think any of us could imagine that it would draw that kind of punishment. And that's how North Korea is different from the places where you and I live.
Is there a big secret police force in North Korea?
Oh, absolutely. The state security apparatus is immense. It reaches into every corner of North Korean life. It's interesting when I've watched, there's a great movie that came out years ago called The Lives of Others, German film that won an Academy Award. It was about the Stasi in East Germany and the role that they played. Watching that, it felt very familiar, but it was also very different because in some ways, that movie was about how little East Germans knew about how their neighbors and their colleagues were spying on them. And it's a little bit different in North Korea because it's been built into their culture and their society in a way that is more a part of daily life and is more apparent in daily life than perhaps in East Germany.
Given the security forces were so big, did you ever suspect that they had planted listening devices in your accommodation or in your office?
I think we always have to be aware that there are surveillance devices. Absolutely. And that's something that I do try to tell anyone who goes to North Korea to be aware that there are possibly surveillance devices, listening audio devices in their hotel rooms.
Far out.
And yeah, it's very hard if that's where you spend most of your time, to watch what you say all the time. But that's what it's like, I think, for North Koreans, is that they have to watch what they say at all times.
Can you tell me about what life is like for North Koreans if you've seen it on the ground? Paint me a little bit of a picture.
Yeah, life is tough. It's a very, very difficult place to live. It's extremely cold in the winter. I mean, it is brutally, brutally cold without any heat, without hot water. You know, they've got limited electricity, limited hot water. Many places don't have running water, including hospitals. And so it's a hard, hard life just to get by. It's very hard for most people to get the right kind of food on the table so that they can raise their children with the nutrients that they need. So you've got chronic malnutrition. I think that with the border being shut down for 2 years, and it is even more extreme than Australia. So they haven't been allowing goods to come in and out of the country either. So if you can imagine imports and exports being stopped as well, that means that they don't have the livelihoods, but they also don't have all of that stuff coming in that you need for a society to function. So on a daily basis, yeah, I think so much of it is about just pure survival.
In terms of technology, do a lot of people own cars or have mobile phones?
During my time there, I saw a huge boom in the use of mobile phones, and that was thanks to an Egyptian telecommunications company, Orascom, that went in and built a 3G network. So we did see a lot of cell phones, and it was fun to watch them learn how to use cell phones the way we did way back in the day. Cars are much more rare. It's very difficult to get a car, and the rules for driving are very complicated. So I think that is still something that is the reserve of the ultra elite. And in Pyongyang, you'll see cars. You see a lot more cars. Of course, there are not many paved roads in the country outside the capital. And so transportation is very, very limited.
Jean, we've all heard that the government propaganda in North Korea is pretty wild. What are some of the more extreme examples of propaganda that you saw during your time there?
The myth-making about the Kim family is amazing. When you go to I spent a lot of time in kindergartens, and it was really useful for me to see how they were educating their children and the propaganda that they were promoting for even kindergartners and children. And a couple things stood out for me. They spent a lot of time learning about the Kim family. And a lot of that is mythology. So the mythology that, for example, that the late leader Kim Jong Un was born in Mount Pakdu, which is the sacred mountain in the far north, and that there were double rainbows appearing in the skies when he was born, and the skies cracked open. It's just incredible mythology, very biblical. And then the other thing, of course, at those kindergartens was the anti-American rhetoric that they learned from a very early age. But the propaganda about the Kim family is interesting because it shows you how they've built the cult of personality. But certainly some of the myths were, I think one of them is Kim Jong Un, the first time he played golf, had a hole in one. Some of them are just, they want to portray their leaders as being, if not supernatural, certainly not like you and me, just more gifted than us, and just a cut above your average human being. So some of these stories some of them about Kim Jong Un are believable, but probably not true.
We've all heard these horrible stories about the prison camps in North Korea. Can you tell me much about those camps?
We can see those camps. I've never visited, but you can see them through satellite imagery. And satellite imagery is a way that we see North Korea from above. And so we can see that they've grown. You can see that there are communities of people who spend large chunks of their lives in these camps. And we estimate that there are hundreds of thousands of people kept in these prison camps. The North Koreans don't call them political prison camps. But as I said, their penal code is vast and covers a lot of ground. So it's very easy to break the laws. And for, I think, officials to find any reason to send somebody who's done something that the local officials may not approve of to one of these prison camps.
Last question. Given all your time there and you spent with the North Koreans, did you find them to be a happy people?
I think one of the things that people find so surprising, and I was just talking about this recently, is that as tough as their lives are, the North Koreans, I do think, for most of the North Koreans I knew, had a great sense of humor and a zest for life, cared about the people around them. And so I think that, are they happy? I mean, I think that they're struggling, but they find joy where they can. I think, do they recognize that their lives might be different if they had been born on the other side of the DMZ? Many of them do. And when it reaches a point where they can't handle the compartmentalization anymore, and they can't handle what their daily lives are like, that's when they may make the decision to defect.
Defecting is pretty much a death sentence if you're caught trying to do it, isn't it?
I wouldn't say necessarily. So there are a lot of people who, before the border closures that were put into place at the start of the pandemic, there were a lot of people going across the border for long periods. And so you did have some people who would have been punished if they were away for too long and if they're believed to have been defected. But some of them do go back to North Korea. So I do think that defection is something that really bothers Kim Jong Un, and he sees it as disloyal and as a repudiation of their system. And so there definitely is punishment. And some of that punishment can be severe. And we have seen the regime and the propaganda use some defectors who've returned. I don't know what we call them, re-defectors or returnees. I'm not sure what the phrase is, but there are some defectors who've gone abroad to South Korea, really found it difficult, and have gone back to North Korea, and then are just heralded in the North Korean propaganda and are used by the regime to talk about how tough life was outside the country. So it's a little bit complicated. I think the families of defectors probably face a more difficult future if a member of their family has left. But then defectors who choose to come back are utilized by the state. So it's a very interesting and complicated issue, how the North Koreans deal with that.
If you'd like to hear more from Jean, you can check out her podcast called The Lazarus Heist. Justin Hastings is a professor in international relations at the University of Sydney. Justin, it's been 10 years since Kim Jong Un became the leader of North Korea after his dad's sudden death. Were there doubts early on in North Korea that he would actually be an effective leader?
Well, certainly he came into office with a lot less preparation than his father had had. Right, so Kim Jong-il had a stroke a couple years before, and he had to accelerate the succession process in favor of his son, who was still in his 20s at the time. So there was some doubts as to how long he could actually hold on for. But when he came into office, he sort of purged all of his father's supporters pretty quickly and established his own supporters in his own position, I think within the first couple of years. And so since then, he's been able to survive pretty well.
You mentioned he purged his dad's loyalists. How many people are we talking about?
Well, it's difficult to tell in North Korea. Certainly, the primary person he purged was his uncle-in-law, John Son-tak, who he had executed in 2013.
Well, now to the latest on the stunning execution of Kim Jong Un's own uncle by the 30-year-old North Korean dictator. The brutal act raising new concern this morning about the erratic leadership of the world's youngest head of state.
But, in terms of the top loyalists, probably talking about a couple hundred people, a couple thousand people who were rotated out or purged in the course of Kim Jong Un establishing his own support.
And what have been Kim Jong Un's priorities during his reign?
Well, so from the beginning, Kim Jong Un has emphasized two major things, right? He wanted to accelerate the nuclear weapons and missile development program, and he wanted to develop North Korea economically. And in fact, for a number of years, that was actually the two primary goals of North Korea explicitly. And since 2018, he has ostensibly focused solely on developing the country economically. And so that is generally how he portrays himself as being wanted to be judged. Has he made North Korea more prosperous by his own people?
We always see headlines about North Korea's nuclear capabilities. Do you know much about what their nukes are capable of? Like, where could their missiles reach?
In theory, the missiles could reach as far as the sort of western coast of the U.S. or as far as Australia. But then you're getting to questions of accuracy. How accurate are they actually? And how many of those missiles do they actually have? The problem for North Korea is that every time they test one of those really long-range missiles, it's going to lead to more sanctions. So they've been very sort of parsimonious about whether they actually test those missiles, especially since 2018 or so. They have a lot more short-range missiles, which they test fairly frequently, but those aren't going to reach further than South Korea, China, or Japan.
So why has Kim Jong Un been building up his missile supply? What's the thinking behind it?
Well, look, to have a successful deterrent against aggression by other countries, you generally need two things, right? You need the nuclear weapons themselves, and you need nuclear weapons that are small enough to be put on delivery devices, which in North Korea's case would be missiles. And without both of those things in tandem, you can't really credibly deter another country from attacking you. What does he want with that? He claims, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, that what he wants is to deter the U.S. from attacking North Korea. And by doing that, he thinks that he'll be able to, in some sense, ensure the survival of North Korea, and more particularly ensure the survival of the Kim dynasty at the top of North Korea.
So it's not likely then that he'd kind of initiate a first strike? We shouldn't be too worried about him just pressing the button one day?
I think it's unlikely. They're unlikely to do that. I mean, if nothing else, Kim Jong Un has shown his ability to survive in power, and sort of just pressing the button would be the fastest way to end his rule. So what the concern is not necessarily that North Korea will launch nuclear weapons, but what they can do conventionally because they have nuclear weapons, right? They can engage in more provocations on the ground against South Korea, for example, against Japan, that they wouldn't be able to do or to get away with if they didn't have nuclear weapons. But in the past couple of years, he's also toned those down as well, and partly because of the diplomacy from Trump, and partly because now they're focused on dealing with COVID.
In the past few years, I've seen a lot of headlines about Kim's sister, Kim Jong, which have suggested that she might actually be the person kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. Is that accurate?
Well, it's difficult to know what happens behind the scenes in North Korea, but I think it's sufficient to say that Kim Jong Un has given her a lot of authority and a lot of power. And like anyone who's not Kim Jong Un, that authority and power waxes and wanes depending on his mood or depending on their performance. But of all the people in North Korea, she probably is the person who most has Kim Jong Un's ear, and is most likely to be, in some sense, viewed as his closest supporter.
Is there any chance at all that his sister could try and topple him and assume power at any stage, or is his leadership pretty safe?
Well, look, I mean, you have to think about it this way. I mean, the Kim family in general they're not the most loving family in the world. Kim Jong Un had his brother Kim Jong Nam assassinated. But in some sense, to the extent that he has loyal supporters, I think Kim Yo-jong is probably going to be the person who is closest to him. I think it's unlikely that they would actually purge her to the extent that she can never be rehabilitated. But right now, we don't see any sense that she hasn't signed for the purge.
Well, that's all for today's episode of I've Got News for You. Thank you so much for listening. Now, we'll be taking a short break and we'll be back on January 4th. But in the meantime, we'll be keeping you up to date on all the news headlines on our other podcast From the Newsroom and, of course, on news.com.au. See you later.